If you want to be able to pass the ball and run the ball, you need those big boys up front to protect and to run block. We have no other place to start than talking about the top 5 offensive linemen in the 2026 NFL Draft. Let's dive in. I'm Warren Sharp. This is Sharp Football Analysis, and I'm joined by Ryan McCrystal. Ryan is an NFL draft expert. He's got the 7th most accurate big board over the last 5 years. He is prolific in his ability to read the room and understand what some of these general managers value and pick the guys that they think are going to be the most coveted. And so there's no better person to talk to than Ryan. If you guys want more of this analysis, make sure you are subscribed right here because we're breaking down all the different position groups with Ryan. And we're going to start with the offensive lineman that you have ranked number 1 in this draft class, and it's Francis Mauigoa. We're going to talk about why you think he is the premier offensive lineman of this class.
Yeah, I love Mauigoa at number 1, and it has a lot to do with his floor. I just have a hard time seeing a scenario where he doesn't pan out. I would certainly listen to an argument where some of the other guys that we'll mention in a minute here have a higher ceiling, but I think Mauigoa is such a safe prospect that I think you'd feel comfortable drafting him in the top 10 and knowing that you're getting a long-term starter somewhere on your offensive line. He was a 3-year starter at Miami at right tackle. He's kind of that big body grinder in the run game at that position. And so he doesn't necessarily have the athletic traits that you see most teams take in the top 10 of the draft at the tackle position. But because he is so physical and he has sort of the body type of a guard already, if it didn't work out, you could certainly start him at right tackle. I definitely would start him there. But if it doesn't pan out, I think you can move him to guard and feel really confident that you've got, a perennial Pro Bowler at guard because he's going to fit right in there. You start him out at tackle because there's a little bit more value at that position, but knowing that you have the confidence of sliding him over and putting him in a position where he's going to be immediately successful at a really high level, I think that raises the confidence. So that's why he's number 1, even though I would agree that others might have a higher ceiling. I think my comparison for him, I'll throw out sort of 2 as sort of like a high end, low end scenario for him as far as comparisons. I think if he pans out at tackle and he proves that he does have the athleticism to stay there, the comparison is sort of like Jason Peters type. Peterson certainly didn't wow anybody with his athleticism, but his athleticism at his size was good enough that he just dominated people with his strength at tackle for a long time in the league. And then the sort of the low end of that, if it doesn't work out for him, if his athleticism proves to not quite be enough to stay on the edge, I think you could slide him inside. And I see him as being sort of like a Roger Saffold type, where that's sort of like the floor, the worst case scenario for him if he goes over to guard. And Saffold was a guy who was drafted to play tackle, didn't quite work out his first couple of years in the league. He was sort of like a low end starter. Moved him to guard, and he eventually became a really high end guy there who was played, for a while towards the end of his career. He was part of a power run scheme in Tennessee, blocking for Derrick Henry. I think Mauigoa would be awesome in that kind of an offense where he's just, grinding it out with the running back who's, just plowing through between the tackles. That's the perfect way to use Mauigoa if you did move him to guard. And so knowing that you can do that with him raises the confidence level so much that even if the ceiling isn't quite as elite as some of these other guys' ceilings, I love getting a guy that you are so confident is going to be a starter on your offensive line for the long term that I'm confident having him as my number 1 tackle in this class.
Man, hearing you talk about him, skill position players, they're the sexy pick, but this guy sounds like a guy who could really anchor an offensive line for years to come. Let's talk about the number 2 best offensive lineman in your class, Spencer Fano out of Utah. Talk to us a little bit about what makes him special.
Yeah, this is an interesting conversation with Fano. He's an athletic tackle. He's tall, but then he's got short arms, under 33 inches, the threshold that a lot of teams care about. And we just went through this last year with Will Campbell getting drafted at the top 10 by the Patriots, and obviously became a big talking point in the playoffs as he kind of struggled after having actually a pretty good rookie year. He definitely did struggle in the playoffs in the Super Bowl. So, the tall tackle with short arms was a talking point just very recently, and now we've got another one who potentially goes in the top 10 again in Fano. You've got to love the athleticism on the edge, but he sort of creates this unique situation with his uncommon build. A tall tackle, the taller tackles at 6'5" and above sometimes have a harder time playing with leverage because it's their instinct to stand up straight, but yet you got to be able to get low to get those edge rushers who are going to try to bend around the edge and beat you with speed. If you have long arms, it's a little bit easier because you can kind of just reach for them and get them. And even if you do have that tendency to play upright, if you've got the wingspan, you can kind of reach out and get your hands on them anyway. But he doesn't have that. So that's the risk. That's what teams are concerned about. However, I want to run through a list of offensive tackles, or at least guys who were drafted to be offensive tackles in the first or second round, guys who were active during last season, who were 6'5" or taller, with arms under 33 inches. So they sort of fall into this range, just like Fano, of guys who are tall, but also short arms. It's sort of give you that awkward build. And the list isn't as scary as you might think. We have Will Campbell. Obviously, the jury's still out on him. He only has 1 year, but it was actually, in totality, despite the playoff struggles, a pretty good year. Then you've got Braden Smith, a very good, steady right tackle for the last decade. Caleb McGarry, a former first-round pick, hasn't reached a really high ceiling, but another steady right tackle. Luke Gedeke in Tampa. He's played both guard and tackle, but he played right tackle last year. Actually had a very good season in Tampa. Another success story. Then there's Liam Eichenberg. He started his career at left tackle and quickly moved to guard. He's been okay, a low-end starter, but not a bust by any means. Then you've got Jordan Morgan. Jury's still out on him after only 2 years in the league. We'll see what happens. Then you've got Jackson Carman, who's really the low end of the spectrum. Didn't pan out for him playing both guard and tackle early in his career in Cincinnati. He's sort of the one guy that I would consider a bust on that list. But that's the list. They've been pretty successful when teams have identified guys who overall have the traits and the refined technique to play at a high level, and they're comfortable drafting them in the first or second round. Even if they're a little tall and have short arms, which is that awkward body type, it's panned out. So I think the team should feel pretty confident in drafting Fano because he was a 3-year starter at Utah and played at a really high level. So he's a unique player because of his body type. But I think he's refined enough in his technique and athletic enough that, we've seen this body type work out. I'm going to be confident in taking him anyway.
That's great analysis, Ryan. Outstanding job. Let's talk about the number 3 best offensive lineman in this class, Venga Ioane out of Penn State. What is he going to do when he transitions to the NFL, and how high do you think teams should be looking to take him?
Yeah, he's the number 1 interior offensive lineman in this class. I don't think most people would argue with that. He's a power run blocker at guard. You're going to draft him and plug him in at left guard, ideally where he played in college, though I'm sure he could make the move to right guard. Any team that needs interior offensive line help that has a power running scheme, you're going to want to draft him and just plug him in right away, and he's probably just going to take off running. A really steady type of player. I think the high-end comparison for him, I would compare him to Laken Tomlinson. Even on the low end, I would compare him to someone like Aaron Banks, who's been a decent starter in the league for a number of years. I think as long as you put Ioane into the right system and you're not asking him to move a whole lot, you're not asking him to pull. As long as he's not in one of those schemes where you're asking him to block on the move a whole lot, I have a hard time seeing a scenario where he's a bust.
Next up, offensive lineman number 4 for you is Kadyn Proctor out of Alabama. Where do you see him slotting in?
Yeah, Proctor is an interesting one because he's got experience at left tackle. He's got the size. I think he's athletic enough even at that size. And I think he's another guy that, like we were talking about with Mauigoa, that if it doesn't quite work out at tackle, if he proves to not have the athleticism to play at a high level there, you could feel pretty confident shifting him inside to guard, where his athletic traits actually probably stand out a little bit. And he could be a guard who blocks on the move pretty well because he does move pretty well for his size. My concern with him is that he's already had a decent amount of experience, and we haven't seen a whole lot of improvement in his pass protection. So that's why he's only number 4 on my board. I'm not bumping him up any higher because I like the traits. I like the floor because I like the fact that you could move him to guard and feel pretty confident you've got a good starter there. But I wish that we had seen more development from him in terms of pass protection, because he should have been better given the experience that he had at Alabama. But then again, he's still only 20 years old. So he's played a lot at a very young age. I don't think we should be surprised if 3 years from now, when he's still only 23 and has been in the league for a few years, that he's ascended to a much higher level. So there's some risk there. But like I said, I'm going to bump up guys like that the bigger tackles who I think can easily shift to guard, those guys are usually going to be higher on my board because, I put myself in the shoes of a GM. If I can feel confident that I'm getting a starter, even if it's not at the position I drafted him at, that player deserves to be drafted a little bit higher. And I think Proctor is that kind of guy.
Rounding out your top 5 offensive linemen, you've got a guy who is the opposite. Instead of having 3 years of starting experience, you have a guy who only has 1 year in Monroe Freeling out of Georgia. Talk to us a little bit about what you think he offers at the next level.
Yeah, Freeling's a tricky one. I think some people are going to have him number 1 on their board. I would not be shocked if he's the first offensive tackle drafted in this year's class. In fact, in my most recent mock draft, I do have him as the first offensive tackle off the board because of all the guys that we've discussed today. He's the one who has the size, the length, and the athleticism. He sort of has the rough outline of the prototypical left tackle. That's Freeling. And he's the only guy near the top of this year's draft board who has those sort of raw traits that you're going to look for. But like you said, he's a 1-year starter, and it was kind of an up and down year. I think, the overall trajectory was positive. He was probably playing his best football at the end of the season. So that's, maybe that eases some concern that we did see a little development even within that 1 year. But man, you've got a really raw offensive tackle like that. If you throw him into the fire, especially if you throw him into the fire when he's not surrounded by a ton of talent, if it's not a great offensive line and teams are able to attack him pretty easily, it could go sideways really quick. And that's where you worry about having bad habits ingrained early on and you just can't get out of it. So I'm not going to have him ranked super high. Number 5 on my board feels sort of like the right place to have a guy who's got a really high ceiling, but you are worried about the bust factor. But I will say if he lands in the right system, like in my mock draft right now, I have him going to Kansas City. That's the kind of team that should feel more confident betting on a high upside guy like that because they've got a really experienced offensive line coach in Andy Heck, who's clearly established himself at one of the best in the business in developing these types of players. So I would have even though I'm a little concerned about him, I'm setting my big board in a vacuum here. I don't know who my offensive line coach is. If you told me it's Andy Heck, yeah, I'm going to feel a little more confident gambling on him. And that could be a situation where he works out. If he lands in a place like Kansas City and gets to work with a great offensive line coach and he turns into the best offensive lineman in this class, that won't surprise me because that's how high his ceiling is.
I love that nuanced take there at the end. Certainly makes a ton of sense. For more great draft analysis from Ryan and the whole Sharp football team, head to sharp.football, sign up for the free newsletter, and make sure that you're subscribed. We'll see you on the next one.